So what I wanted to move on to, though I'm really glad that you pulled us back for that, is some of your work on disgust. And because I conflated at first blame with anger, and there's this whole constellation of other words that I could have used and conflated it with, so scolding, for example. But just how do you define disgust?
Yeah. So I will admit that this one's a bit easier because a lot of legwork has been done on these emotions already, and to the point where like the neural stuff that I said doesn't matter, has been has been done on it. So disgust is an emotion. Now, that word has some connotations, but for now we'll use it. Disgust is an emotion that seems to be sensitive to contamination. So it's an emotional response to stimuli that potentially can threaten like parasites and poisons, like it might make you sick. So it is associated, right? It emerges in childhood. It seems to be universal. It's associated with one or maybe two very specific facial expressions, the kinds of things that make people disgusted in one culture often make people disgusted in other cultures. In fact, while there's a lot of variability, the things that are common, like, and sorry if I'm about to discuss people, because even though words are disgusting, but like urine, feces, pus, blood, all of those things tend to make people disgusted across cultures, no matter where you're raised. And so yeah, a strong emotional response with an avoidance motivation that seems to have evolved in order to keep us from ingesting things that could kill us. So one way of thinking of it is, before we even had a germ theory of disease, evolution gave us an appropriate set of responses such that when we're faced with things that over and over again would have killed us in our environment, when it comes to like pathogens and poisons, it gave us a strong natural response to stay away from this. Putrid meat is another example. Right now, it's far from a perfect emotion. Right, a lot of things that aren't dangerous make us disgusted now. A lot of things that are dangerous don't make us disgusted. But what are you going to do? Evolution it's not God. Right. So yeah, it's on the list for the people who care about making lists of basic emotions, like the emotions that seem to be recognized by everybody. Disgust is one of those. So like fear, anger, sadness, joy, surprise, and disgust tend to be those the list that everybody bandies about.
This might be outside your ken, but this was many years ago that I was reading about this. But I think that there have been studies in which people across cultures are they're photographed when they're experiencing certain emotions, and then people in other cultures are shown these pictures and asked to identify the emotion that the photographed person is exhibiting. And I'm wondering if disgust is one of these
Yeah,
where
in fact, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, that's exactly where those lists of basic emotions get the strongest evidence for them. Yeah. So disgust is always on that list. So the disgust face is that strong, that wrinkled nose. In fact, there's some evidence that the wrinkled nose prevents pathogens from entering the nasal cavity, and that's why we wrinkle our nose. So there's experimental evidence that wrinkling the nose does prevent pathogens. So it makes for an interesting story for how it could have evolved, whether or not that's why it evolved.
Going back to that ostracism study, I imagined that if you had some fancy apparatus attached to somebody's brain and you have them walk through a hallway where you tell them all of these mannequins in there are not real, but they're all very lifelike and they have disgust expressions, and they follow the person walking through, their brain is going to light up as if everybody's disgusted with them.
Yeah, that's That's actually not a bad idea for an experiment.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah, you're right. So that emotion, yeah. Now, when we can get into this, but what I've just described is a really low level emotion. It's almost like a reflex that you get. Like if you see vomit, automatically you can't help it. I can show pictures. I can get people in the audience to just reliably feel disgust, report disgust, make the disgust face, close their eyes, not want to see those things. But there is another sense, at least, that we use in English and in the United States and in other languages and other countries, often use the word disgust to mean strong disapproval, like as a social emotion. So we say, I'm disgusted at the politics of Joe Biden or whatever, Donald Trump, where there it's not at all clear that you're actually feeling grossed out. Rather, you're just trying to express strong disapproval, sometimes anger. So for that reason, I sometimes like to say gross and grossed out, because that doesn't have the connotations of the way that the social way in which we use the term disgust.
Have there been, obviously the studies would be quite similar. I started saying different and then went to similar. So dissimilar came out, but I meant to say different. Obviously the studies would be quite different from the ones that were comparing blame and praise, because you were trying to figure whether or not they were flip sides of the same coin. But is there a similar program that is aimed at trying to determine whether the social disgust you described and the grossed out disgust are the same faculty, or whether they're different and we just happen to use in English the same word?
Yeah, no, that's like, you're spot on with your question, because the way that I described it, I believe that there's a difference. Like, I actually believe that when people use the term disgusted in that social sense, that they're not really being grossed out. Now, what's evidence for my view? People make the face. Like, people will say, I have relatives for which all I have to say is the word Donald Trump, and they'll go like this. They'll say they're disgusted. They'll make the face. They'll engage in avoidance behaviors. They don't want to they will move away from your picture of Donald Trump or whatever. So what evidence can I have that in fact they are two different emotions? Because one view, a very popular view, I think I'm kind of against a lot of the field that studies this, is that disgust evolved to be this grossed out emotion to protect us from pathogens, but it was co-opted socially so that it genuinely is the case now that immoral agents, for instance, give rise to real disgust. It's the same emotion. I don't believe that that's the case. One of the reasons that I don't
you
believe
don't believe that that's the case?
No, I don't believe that it's genuine disgust when people are.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying you didn't believe that it branched off at somewhere along the evolutionary timeline, but you are agreeing with that.
No, I'm saying that this co-opted hypothesis that people. To be clear, this view, this exaptation view or the co-opted view, is that disgust evolved through natural selection for the putrid meat and pus. And then because we're social creatures, evolution was like, we could use this same emotion to stay away from people who we find morally abhorrent. And so that view is that it's genuinely the same disgust emotion. It's just that this class of things that elicits it grew. My view is that, no, we're just using the term in a metaphorical way, much like we would say, I lust after that new MacBook Pro. Nobody believes that you really are lusting. after the Mac. Well, hopefully nobody believes that you're really lusting after the MacBook Pro. It's just a handy way of saying metaphorically, I really, really want it. I have a strong desire for it. I think that's how the word disgust is used. I think that it's such a powerful emotion that if I go like this to somebody when they say, they bring up whatever politician I dislike, that it's a really good way of communicating that I dislike that politician. I don't think people are being actually grossed out. Now, one reason I believe this is if you look at other languages, in Spanish, I'm a native Spanish speaker. My parents are Spanish speakers. Usually the word that we have for disgust means gross, but it's not really used for the social word in the way that it is in English. So I think that if it were really the case, and then there are other languages where it's even clearer that there's the word for gross, that's that low level, like stay away from putrid meat and pus and feces. And then there is a social disapproval. And they don't have overlapping vocabularies for those two in the way that English does. I think that if it were genuinely the same emotion, that is, same neural mechanisms, the same phenomenology, all that stuff, then people would categorize it the same way. Linguistically, they would code for it in the same way across the world, much like people do for anger and sadness.
It's fascinating that you can take this linguistic evidence into account in psychology, but obviously you're going to reach for whatever tools you have, and that's a very good one. But this is parenthetical. I don't know when this would have been. This must have been a few months ago on an early episode of Psych that I listened to this. But I think you said that there is a word in Spanish for the first time you wear clothes. Is that? Do you remember why that was relevant?
Yeah. So why were we talking? We were talking about linguistic relativism. Whether or not language.
Wharf Sapir.
Exactly. Wharf. Yeah. Sapir Whorf. And so some people argue that there are cultures that encode for concepts linguistically and other cultures that don't have that linguistic label, that term, don't have the concepts in some deep way. And so I was just bringing that up because I think about it all the time. Like there is just one word that saves me all the work of saying, I'm putting on these shoes for the first time today. But that the argument that I don't have the concept for it seems ridiculous. It seems like obviously I do because I just communicated the concept. Yeah. Yeah, but it's the same. Yeah. Estrenar. So yeah. Yeah. Now, look, Spanish is so divided. Like it may be that in some countries it's a different word. They don't have that word, but yeah, estrenar.
Where are your parents from? Just curious.
My father is from Chile and my mother's from Argentina. So, and then I was born in Argentina and came here when I was 2. So, I'm
Pizarro definitely sounds like a conquistador name.
He was a conquistador, a very nasty character. Yeah, I hope I'm not related to that asshole. Yeah.
So, thank you for indulging my interest in language for a minute. Now, what then, or in what ways does social disgust, now that we've distinguished between, actually, I think I read in the literature, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the one account is called the pathogen avoidance account and the other is extended disgust. Yeah,
very good. Those are the terms that Yoel Imbar and I came up with to try to describe the two. Yoel Imbar is a professor at University of Toronto who has been my collaborator on pretty much everything discussed I've ever done. He was a grad student here at Cornell. Yeah, so we were trying to distinguish between those two, and we report in a review paper that came out a few years ago. We try to cover the whatever basis we could for trying to distinguish between these two. There's other evidence, right? But one of the things about disgust, the gross part, is how associationistic it is. So if you are, if there's a gross thing and you touch that gross thing, now you're gross. Like I avoid you. This gets back to the germ theory of disease. It's super interesting that evolution kind of gave us intuitions, to go back to the about contagion. And so people who come in close contact with pathogens, we do avoid. People who made the mistake of touching, dipping their hands in gross things, we want to avoid. That doesn't seem to happen for other emotions that require more judgment about what's going on. So if I'm afraid of a lion and you touch a lion, I'm not now afraid of you, right? The way that people use disgust in the social sense seems to be more like fear and anger than it does like grossness, right? You can't, maybe I'll say if you touch Donald Trump, I'm disgusted by you now, but I don't really mean that I'm avoiding you with the same kind of passion that I would if you had touched.
Mm-hmm. My favorite strange phenomenon, somewhat related to this associativity issue you were discussing, is that nobody finds their own spit particularly disgusting. But if you spit your spit out, like even if it's onto a perfectly sanitized surface, and then think about like licking it back up again and putting it in your mouth, that's a totally gross idea. And that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think William James might have described this phenomenon when he talked about the self, and he wasn't making a point about disgust. He was making a point about the sort of physical limits of what is me and what isn't me, and how just a few moments outside of me can all of a sudden make it disgusting. I mean, hair is kind of that way too. A hair on a person's head is not nearly the disgust object that a hair is when it's off that person's.